Hello. As you may have noticed, I began really ramping up video making with my Ace Combat reviews. Now, as much as I still think some of them hold up, it was a very much learning experience. And even more so, there was some stuff I think I kind of missed out on, or just ended up on the cutting room floor. That is what this series functions as, an extra video series where I can get around to any remaining bits of Ace Combat stuff I think are worth mentioning. Today, I want to focus on Ace Combat 3, Electrosphere. Now, it's not a secret, I think that Electrosphere stands out for me as one of my favorite Ace Combat games. I mentioned a good chunk of what I thought was worth mentioning in its dedicated review, but I just found more and more extra bits afterwards. I was picking up on elements it took me some time to really process and understand. Some things are just like that. They need a second or third or fourth run through of a game or movie or whatever to really pull out and enjoy, to really understand. In a single sense, what I'm going to talk about in particular in regards to Ace Combat 3 is a very simple question. Where does our vision of the future come from? I know, it's a bit abstract, but hear me out. As a kid, I vividly remember my mind going wild with images of shows on the Discovery Channel, of impossibly huge buildings and machines and bright glass and white, and I saw science fiction stories filled with incredible cool futures. But as I got older, I watched older science fiction, and I started to notice something strange. Movies and stories from different periods had different styles to them. Even though the future of these settings could exist as far away as the year 2500 AD, what it looks like changes. And this brings us to the two main points which I think a lot of people already know about this stuff. One, our modern world is boring, and to see a cooler what-if world, science fiction shows us a potential future or setting. And two, as our real-life society changes, we want our stories about that future to change with it, to reflect what we think will be cool, or how we think technology will look. Okay, so that's where I started from. But then I read a little story. It's called 20th Century Boys, and I suddenly got it. See, 20th Century Boys is about the generation who grew up to be adults right around the turn of the millennium. Without going too in detail into that fantastic manga by Naoki Urasawa, it's a story all about that generation who came to terms with what they thought the year 2000 would be like. And as I read it, something snapped into place. The neurons connected, and I realized the simple truth that was in front of me the whole time. The art and stories I grew up with had to be made by adults. Like everyone, those adults grew up from kids, who themselves, like me, dreamed about the future and what it would be like. You see, it was there the whole time. In addition to the first 2 points about the future and science fiction, there was a third. 3. What the future looks like to one generation is also made up of past visions of what people thought it would look like in previous generations. Those who themselves had a dream of their own version of the future. That is to say, like all of our art, culture, ideas, and designs, they don't just really vanish. They are resurrected and reincorporated into new visions of the future for new generations. Okay, so what exactly is an example of that, and how does any of it really relate to Ace Combat 3? Well, it's time for something I broke out just a little while ago.
No, stop. Don't go any further. Nobody let him finish. Nobody let him get into it right now. He's gonna go off the deep end, and he's not gonna...
Architecture. Baby, I love it. Because it's really honestly staring most people in the face, and they blow right past it. See, a very pivotal thing that happened in Japanese culture was the Japan 1970 Osaka Expo. This expo was specific in that it was extremely focused on very futuristic buildings and design. And really, think about it. Just a year before, in 1969, the space race climaxed with the Apollo moon landings. Technology and the world seemed to be leaping ahead. Home radios, followed by television, followed by eventually color television, followed by the earliest personal computers. Things were really moving quite fast, and to the average person, the Osaka Expo 1970 was not just some weird attraction. It was like a real look into the future of what living might be like. And for, I don't know, an impressionable young child who would one day grow up to become an artist, maybe making video games, movies, or stories, or perhaps anime and manga, I wonder if it would leave some kind of impression. And so finally, we can return to Ace Combat 3, What I was picking up on was this use of these inspirations: Port Edward's superhighways and massive pinnacle towers, the curved natural lines and artificial structure of Megafloat, or the domes and carnival-like peaks of, hold on, wait a minute, Osaka Expo 1970. Gee, I wonder if there's any connection. Oh boy. For years, I had been picking up on the use of shared design, and it was obvious in the back of my mind there was some connection between Expo 1970 and Ace Combat 3. But the Ace Combat 3 developer interviews go into and basically confirmed I was right all along on this. Specifically, Voices of AC3 Development Staff, Part 8, which very much big thanks to the folks at Usea Today for translating. Thanks to their efforts, we can now see what these interviews were about. Part 8 in particular focuses on the graphic team, the team responsible for shaping the world of Ace Combat 3 visually. In the first part, which is an interview with Manabu Okano, who was the map designer on Ace Combat 3. Under the section labeled Fusion of the Ideal Future Image of 1970s and Modern Design, boy, I wonder what happened in, the 70s, or exactly in 1970, we in particular get a great quote. When I think of images from the 70s, I see huge buildings with lots of streamlining. But designing cities and military facilities in those shapes is so far-fetched that it causes problems with the lack of scale and realistic detail, and the limitations of polygon display. There is a difference between the streamlined shape of the Newcom and the linear shape of General Resources. But they could not be built without including modern reality as a premise. So we very bluntly have what I mentioned in my third point, the reincarnation of the futurism of the past. The fact that both AC3 and 20th Century Boys draw back to it is so important. I do think it shows you how influential Expo 1970 had in terms of its impact on the visualization of just what the future looked like for a generation of creators and people growing up in Japan. The post-World War II brutalism of concrete and straight lines, I think, has always pushed people to imagine a future where we return to that nature use of gliding curves and arches. I think the concept art for Ace Combat 3 shows this really well. They really wanted to dive into a reincorporation of that 70s into this new late 90s vision of flowing, streamlined futures. And I really have to say, it makes so much sense. Like, okay, hear me out. These buildings, they show up in a lot of things, generally speaking, this rough style, and they're very futuristic looking. But in particular, with Ace Combat 3, unlike a lot of those, you're specifically making a game about jets. Future streamlined jets. And now you're using futuristic streamlined buildings to also express that. What you are feeling when you play Ace Combat 3 is just that. A synchronicity bonus in the design of the world. All of its elements are being considered and designed towards the expression of that core feeling, of that idea. It's so fucking awesome, and it's a real credit to artistic expression. Whenever any art or game does this, it improves the hell out of it, and it just impresses me, and I really appreciate it so much. But does it go even further? You know, like, I don't know, say the interface of Ace Combat 3. It's called Data Swallow, right? Clearly, it's like a web browser. Okay. And, I don't know, maybe swallows build nests out of tightly packed and harvested twigs. So it's like pretty straightforward. It's a web browser which collects the data and information of Ace Combat 3's Electrosphere, or Mega Internet, and shows it to you, the player, acting as the game's menu interface. But what if I told you once again, yep, that's right, Osaka Expo 1970 is the reference, specifically from the book Architecture of Instruction and Delight, Peter van Wijsmel. This book includes a portion that looks at Osaka Expo, and it mentions what the function of its data swallows were. The data swallows were essentially a group of young women who worked through the expo. Their job was to collect information from the various expo exhibits and guests, and then transport that information to a central control room, which would then relay that information to the relevant departments. In essence, it's a kind of nervous system for Expo 1970. And now, in Ace Combat 3, Data Swallow is your connection into the Electrosphere itself. It's just a finite detail, but it's being considered. Once more, design is thought of and focused on. Of course, other elements share this as well. When you put this much objective quality in, of course you're really going to focus on the little stuff. All later Ace Combat games would inherit a very distinct sense of factions through visual design from 3, in particular the use of color. 3's expression was clearly through some elements I mentioned already in my Ace Combat 3 review, but also others such as the logos of the corporations. Minoru Sashida, who worked as graphic designer on Ace Combat 3, mentions this very directly. In order to make such a setting easier to understand and more persuasive, we have to set the logo mark of each organization. A company's logo is an expression of the company's identity, so it should be able to convey its atmosphere at a glance. The general star design with its absolute power. Newcom's a younger and flexible company, so it's all about vivid colors and sleek lines. UPEO is a peacekeeping organization with a symbolic placement of the dove that's a little more accessible. And this is fascinating to me because I mentioned before Ace Combat 3 reincarnated ideas from the 1970s, of futurism. But it's not just an outright copy. The 90s were a certain time and place. As I mentioned earlier, the second point, our visions of the future are also colored by the world we live in now. And for the time period of the later 90s, computers were very hot stuff. The internet, which, had just basically begun, was a big influence on other works like Ghost in the Shell, of which certain staff are shared with Ace Combat 3, and others like Serial Experiments Lane. It was being dreamed about, and the game is called Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere. The title very directly means the sphere of electronic information that encloses and connects our world, just like our atmosphere. So with that idea of computers and technology, of the internet, of that formative decade of the 90s, which was the basis of cyberpunk, we can return to Ace Combat 3, and that visual design. See, it's not even very subtle, really. Newcom is Apple Computers, and General Resources is IBM. Ta-da! It's something that might be lost on younger audiences because they maybe don't remember what the state of affairs was back then. And these days, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and whoever are just kind of these nebulous supercorps that really lack any clear distinction in that same way. See, General Resources is utilitarian. It's boring. It's the standard megacorp with a simple gray and blue pattern, and it goes for a very simple aesthetic as well. It's industrial, and it uses bought-up and retooled versions of older fighter jets. It's like an IBM personal computer of the, say, 300 series. A dull, pale, gray-white machine that does work and is standardized and used by a good chunk of the world. In comparison, Newcom is hip. Newcom is cool. Its planes are space-age and organic. They're named after animals, and their main business is in next-generation tech like satellites and cool internet computer business. And so their jets are like the jet version of an iMac G3. It's cool, it's neon, it's the future. It's got a style, and it's got an aesthetic. Speaking of which, Ace Combat 3 soundtrack is also super woven into that late 90s trance/techno/house style. Not just its graphics, but its music as well is focused on weaving together all of those ideas of that future from that time. And really, it was always sad to me how neglected AC3 is when, my god, so much of it has this love poured into fine-tuning this whole package. For God's sake, they obsessed about Ace Combat 3 Photosphere. You know what that was? It was just a friggin' promotional booklet. It was a fucking pamphlet, and they still wanted to get it right. Like, this one quote from Ace Combat 3 and its team really sums it up. Electrosphere is 2 CDs that are 120% made with the staff's desire to try new things. It was a game made with such a passion for finely designing all of its world's tiny details. It was something that set a benchmark for design that later games, even to this day, 20 years later, still use. Like, geez, I just wish it got some fucking recognition for it. And so let's end by returning to that question. Where does our vision of the future come from? What in art makes it physical? The answer is a myriad tapestry of elements, audio and visual. World design and architecture, graphic design and logos, loads of style. It comes from musicians, it comes from architects, it comes from programmers, it comes from graphic designers. It comes from the world we currently live in and look forward from. But it also comes in pieces from those futures imagined by those who came before us. Their dreams which never came to be, inherited by those after them. All of these elements, when made well, when put effort into, not only objectively achieve a quality of art you really cannot deny, they also polarize all of that into a place, into a setting, a world just always out of our reach ahead of us, and that which entices us forward into desiring it, into the world of the future. That is where our vision comes from. And on a slightly melancholic note, I wish more creators had picked up that style, and carried it forwards. But at the same time, times change. New things take their place. New visions of the future. But I'm not sad though. That world is not gone. Because the things I love are just sleeping. Those styles are just waiting for a new creator to take them up because I get this feeling, a feeling that I already do know. Now, it's not their turn anymore. Now it's my turn. I have to be one of those new creators. I have to hope to try to inspire, to weave that place into being, for the next generation of young, foolish dreamers like myself. To show those new people that beautiful, fleeting vision of the future, of what could be.